So this trade debate right now is epic in several ways, but it's not new. We are in a time where we are potentially shifting from a silly pursuit of fictional free trade to something else. Maybe strategic trade, maybe something else. But we're living through an epic shift. And it's also at a time when we could be having an epic shift of geopolitical superpowers from the US to China in the next 15 years. So there's that behind what's going on. And if you listen to the press that are freaking out about tariffs and trade intervention and the like and trade wars, while not recognizing that China has been in a trade war against us for the last 24 years. We just have failed to respond. You'll think this is kind of new, but this free trade versus protecting your own national interest debate is over 200 years old. I'm going to trace the history of this a little bit and how free trade is not what built America and is a recent phenomenon, and how other countries have used strategic trade to build from poor to rich. And then I'm going to go into a little bit about what's going on with this administration, what to expect, and the like. But our chairman, Dan D'Amico of Nucor Steel, was, we're bipartisan. We have AFL-CIO, we have Teamsters on our board. Dan D'Amico was the chair of Trump's trade transition team, so he had a big say in who was chosen to run the trade policy in the administration. And we have nice, good relations with those folks even today. But there's something called the American system of economics that we have forgotten. Alexander Hamilton was the father of it. Back in the late 1700s, the U.S. was just newly, licking its wounds from the Revolutionary War, largely an agrarian society. And Alexander Hamilton wrote in 1789 the Report on Manufactures, which and delivered to George Washington, which was a report stating that we need to use tariff protection for revenue, for protecting nascent industries, to build industry, to build infrastructure to fund our government in order to build a country. It was a proposition, the American system of economics was the proposition that the U.S. should seek strategic but not unconditional integration with the world economy. And this system dominated the U.S. from its founding until, the mid-20th century. It was adopted by Germany, Asia, and others. So Hamilton worried, remember at that time Britain was the incumbent superpower. They were the workshop to the world. Hamilton worried that a pure free trade stance would relegate us to merely being a natural resource provider to Britain. We would be, in essence, a continuing banana republic. So he could have chosen cheap imports from Europe, but they chose instead to take the more strategic route of building productive capacity in this country. George Washington agreed. In Washington's first address to Congress, he said, "A free people should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies." So you listen again and think that America is the free trade leader, the low tariff leader. We were in recent years, but that's not how we started. In fact, Hamilton's policies came down to protective duties, prohibition of exporting materials of manufacturers, so you wouldn't export them for someone else to manufacture. You keep them here, so we did. These are people that are building a country, right? They're building a country from scratch. Export subsidies to subsidize some exports at times. Subsidies here, they call them premiums. Subsidies here for new innovations to get industries going that are at a pre-competitive status, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, those who say this is un-American, The second bill ever enacted by Congress was a tariff bill. It was partly for revenue, but it also declared that the tariff was necessary for the encouragement and the protection of manufacturers. Right, the second bill. And of course, the Constitution itself says in Article 1, Section 8, that the federal government has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. The power to tariff is in the Constitution. So Thomas Jefferson, actually, who I admire, was initially a free trader. He opposed Hamilton. But he came around a little later after the War of 1812, when we again fought Britain, the incumbent superpower. And he changed his tune. He said in 1816 that to be independent for the comforts of life, we must fabricate them, the comforts of life, ourselves. Manufacturers are now as necessary to our independence as to our comfort. So he continued several years later. When he became president, he actually discontinued most of America's internal taxes and relied exclusively on tariff revenue. In his inaugural address, he said, "The remaining revenue on the consumption of foreign articles is paid cheerfully by those who can afford them, being collected on our seaboard and frontiers only. It may be the pleasure and pride of any American to ask what farmer, what mechanic or laborer ever sees a tax gatherer in the U.S.? That's how we funded our government." James Madison, James Monroe continued the American system thereafter. They said it may be in 1820, James Monroe, I believe, said, "It may be fairly presumed that under the protection given to domestic manufacturers by the existing laws, we shall become at no distant period a manufacturing country on an extensive scale." All right. Fast forward to the 1870s or 1880s, we became the biggest economy in the world. It worked. Now, Karl Marx was a free trader, but only because of its destructive capacity. He said in Brussels in 1848, "The protective system these days is conservative, while the free trade system works destructively. It breaks up old nationalities and carries antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie to the utmost point. In this revolutionary sense alone, gentlemen, I am in favor of free trade." We continued the system of tariffs through the early 1900s. Woodrow Wilson was the first kind of free trader that wanted to do the tariff cuts. He did so, and they introduced the income tax system to fund more of government. But Calvin Coolidge came in the 1920s. So remember, Wilson was the 19-teens during World War I. Calvin Coolidge came in during the 1920s, and he raised the tariffs back up again. So you hear Smoot-Hawley all the time, but you don't hear, the rest of the story. And he said, "Our tariff enables us," this is important, "our tariff enables us to pay American workmen the highest wages in the world. Before we get carried away with any visionary expectation of promoting the public welfare by a general avalanche of cheap goods from foreign sources, imported under a system which, whatever it may be called, is in reality free trade, it will be first to count the cost and realize just what such a proposal really means. I am for the protection because it maintains American standards of living and business for agriculture, industry, and labor." So the focus on building productive capacity as opposed to cheap goods is part of that high wage strategy. And actually in the 1800s, even though we were a nascent economy, we were a high wage economy in comparison to Europe. So you hear about the infamous Smoot-Hawley Act that was enacted in 1930, but you don't hear people talk about is they imply that it killed our economy, it caused the Great Depression. Well, it couldn't have, because the Great Depression happened a year earlier in 1929. It was a monetary crisis. It spread through the globe. Trade shrank around the globe because countries were shrinking in their economies. And Smoot-Hawley raised tariffs a bit, only on about 1/3 of our goods. The rest came in duty-free. They didn't raise tariffs even up to pre-Woodrow Wilson levels. And in fact, if you compare imports of the Smoot-Hawley tariffed items to the non-tariffed items, there was a similar drop in trade between them. So it's a big fantasy that Smoot-Hawley is this sort of lesson forever that we must avoid. It wasn't until FDR that his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, convinced us to start on the free trade route, and to, in the middle of the Great Depression, they cut tariffs at the Secretary of State level in an attempt to get trade going again, but that failed because the economy wasn't going. You've got to have a good economy. The trade is a result, not a cause. It failed until we got World War II, which was a big, massive stimulus for our economy that got things going again. And then after World War II, we were the biggest superpower in the world. We were 50% of the world economy, and we became the free traders. But that's our story. We did not go from poor to rich under free trade. And Germany took our approach. Of German economists by the name of Friedrich List, took Hamilton's system. They both dismissed Adam Smith as a cosmopolitan economist. And he said, the result of a general free trade would not be a universal republic, but on the contrary, a universal subjugation of the less advanced nations to the predominant manufacturing, commercial, and naval power. So Germany also did not want to be permanently in the back seat of Great Britain, which was the incumbent superpower. So they protected their manufactories, and they built into the biggest economy in continental Europe, and of course caused some problems thereafter with World War I and the like. But List argued, and this is fundamental because you hear, oh, we're going to kill the economy with these, we're not going to have, we're going to have as cheap a consumer goods as we used to have. He said, a society's well-being and its overall wealth are determined not by what a country can buy, but by what it can make. That sentence helps you cut through a lot of the noise, because every time you listen to CNBC or John Thune or any of the pundits or the amateur economists or the professional economists who have frozen out anyone who believes otherwise, they believe we build our society on what we can buy, not what we can make. Okay? Japan was influenced by List and Hamilton. They took that system and erected tariffs. They went through and did the new age, the recent modern age. You have to devalue your currency too, because that is like a tariff on imports and a subsidy on exports, all of them, right? And so that's what Japan did. When they were Japan Inc., they were eating our lunch, they were a currency manipulator. South Korea went from poor to rich with a system of tariffs, currency undervaluation, and subsidies for their industries. Hyundai, Kia, Samsung, into building them into national champion industries with massive supply chains that employed a lot of Koreans. It worked. They went from a poor, war-torn agrarian economy, post-Korean War, to a first world economy that way. They could have said, our citizens are poor. We need to buy cheap goods from somewhere else so they can afford to live. No, because the game for trade intervention is this. You do trade intervention because the gain you get in production and aggregate wages exceeds what you give up on the consumer side. Again, fundamental. So China did the same. In 1994 is when the tipping point was. We enacted the NAFTA. They devalued their renminbi by about 40%, making everything Chinese 40% cheaper to the rest of the world, like a massive subsidy, just as if they wrote a check to subsidize all their exports, everything, right? and it was a 40% tariff on incoming goods, so everything we would sell to them was 40% more expensive. And then they started, you imagine what would happen here? And they had tariffs, and they had massive subsidies to government-owned industries, which is, you have the national champion industries, somewhat in the US in the old days, but in Korea and Japan. But in China, it's government-owned, right? And so every pundit on CNBC here would say, it's horrible, it's terrible, that's going to kill the country. They went on to grow by 16% per year. And in the 2000s, they grew by 10% per year. And they pulled more people out of poverty, to their credit, than we've ever seen in the history of the world. They didn't do it with free trade. Now they're a real problem for us. We've got to push back. They're a predatory. They do predatory economics. They're a strategic competitor of ours. And I'll get into that. The point is, every country in the world that has ever gone from poor to rich has done it through some version of the Hamiltonian American system of economics, of intervention. Conversely, no country in the world has ever gone from poor to rich with free trade. Never. Fast forward now to Germany. Germany is actually the biggest net exporter in the world now, bigger than China. They're a big currency manipulator. And I accused them of that last May when I was in Berlin speaking to a group of them, and they invited me back. They liked the accusation so much, I guess. So I'm going there in 2 weeks to Frankfurt. But they're a strong economy hiding behind a weak euro, in that they bought into the euro, they exchanged the Deutschmark for euros at an advantageous price, which was a good devaluation then. Then they took some internal smart decisions to boost their economy, their wage-based productivity and the like. So they continued getting stronger, and they were exporting to Southern Europe and taking out their workers, the pigs countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. And so Germany has this ongoing net export full employment project, and exports to Southern Europe, taking out their workers, and they're unemployed, and they can't pay their bills. Greece has a crisis. So what's happening is the pigs countries in peripheral Europe drags the value of the euro down. And so the euro's too strong for those countries, but it's great for Germany because they're dragging the euro down for Germany. So everything German is cheaper than it should be. So that's a big problem. When you hear about euro instability, or because of the populace, or people want to break from Europe, the cause is Germany. And we can get into that further, but the cause is, if Europe doesn't survive, the Eurozone doesn't survive, the cause is going to be Germany. They're a very nice group of people. I really like them, and they're destroying the EU. So now we've got China, and you don't hear it so much. It used to be laughed at. Well, let me put it this way. China, 6 months ago, China was saying, we're the new defenders of free trade, and pushing free trade and saying they're the ones that Trump was a protectionist, isolationist. Because that hasn't lasted that long, but there's a quote I want to read you from Dennis Shea, who is our now ambassador to the WTO. And China went to the WTO after Trump imposed tariffs, 232 steel and auto, tariffs on steel and aluminum. And they were saying how the U.S. is protectionist and the like, and they've got to take a look at what to do about us. So this is what Dennis Shea, it was noted as one of the most intense exchanges at the WTO that they'd ever seen. And this is what he said, this is 2 months ago. He said, "We have now entered the realm of Alice in Wonderland. White is black, up is down. It is amazing to watch a country that is the world's most protectionist, mercantilist economy position itself as the self-proclaimed defender of free trade and the global trading system. The WTO must avoid falling down this rabbit hole, into a fantasy world, lest it lose all credibility. The truth is, it is China that is the unilateralist, consistently acting in ways that undermine the global system of open and fair trade. Market access barriers too numerous to mention, forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft on an unprecedented scale, indigenous innovation policies, and the Made in China 2025 program. Discriminatory use of technical standards, massive government subsidies that have led to chronic overcapacity in key industrial sectors, and a highly restrictive foreign investment regime. These are the issues that should be on today's agenda. If the WTO wishes to remain relevant, it must, with urgency, confront the havoc created by China's state capitalism. Isn't that nice? So you will also read in the paper that there have been U.S.-China talks, and there may be a compromise, or we're hoping there's a compromise. And there's talks, there was talks last week. Well, nothing happened. This is going to, in my judgment, and we know a lot of the folks. We talk to them. We try to provide them some support and that sort of thing that are making the decisions. And certainly, there are some old-style free traders in the administration too. But this is going to be the new normal. Is a long series of moves and counter moves on trade, on tariffs. The first tariffs were 201, so-called safeguard tariffs on dishwashers and solar panels, imported dishwashers and solar panels because of a flood taking out our industry. People squawked about job loss. I said it's horrible that we're ending up actually rebuilding a solar panel industry. We've had 10 plants either in the process of being built, reopened, or in the plans. Clothes washers, and then we went to the steel and aluminum tariffs based on Section 232 of a 1962 law based on national security. Now that's an interesting one, the national security, because remember the trade debate of 4 or 5 years ago, the Dems in the House were the most with us on trade, opposing the trade agreements, mostly on labor and environmental grounds and some other things. But the GOP free traders were the big problem. And, so the Trump administration, one of their biggest enemies on their trade agenda is their own party, the GOP free traders that want open borders on goods and services. But the Republican Party is very for national security. And so you see that these tariffs are based on national security grounds, where they had a 300 and 400-page report that documented why steel and aluminum are core foundations of a military industrial capacity, and that we're losing it. And it's dual use. It's not only military, but it's civilian, because you can't build a viable industry at scale with just military. The Soviet Union tried that and they failed because they didn't have a civilian demand. You got to have the scale, the innovation, you got to have the supply chains, the worker training, the infrastructure to do that. And oh, by the way, China has declared its steel and aluminum industry as national security priorities in the past too. People said, ha ha ha, how can you do this? Well, other countries do too. So we were getting flooded by aluminum and steel, which had drastically taken out a lot of our industry, and most of the aluminum industry, worse than even steel. But we looked at the data, and you know what? China subsidizes it. They built massive overcapacity that was designed to take over the industry globally and take out other countries. But the only country that allowed the overcapacity to flow in and take out their industry was us. Europe did not. Free trade Europe, they didn't do that. They had their own protection. They didn't do it as noisily, but they did. Canada, Japan, South Korea, they all have steel industries at the core of their industrial ecosystem, and they protect them. And we were the only ones that were allowing big net exports. If you look around, nobody else was. Turkey had a big steel industry they subsidized. They're having a few problems now, of course. So once we decided to put the steel tariffs up with all the fanfare, and they're saying we're not free trade, and that sort of thing, all of a sudden everyone else doesn't want the job of being the absorber of global overcapacity. And so Europe is putting up tariffs, so they don't get the job of being the absorber. And then Canada is doing it. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Goodhair, is putting up tariffs now, and he's a free trade guy, right? Until they're free trade, until they're the ones of being the importer of last resort. Okay? So Section 232 is based on national security. You hear might do auto tariffs based on national security, and that would be because the auto supply chain is the one that you pivot to wartime footing. So if you have a war, you pivot from civilian to military manufacturing, but you don't start that from scratch, right? The automotive supply chain is the biggest industrial supply chain in our country. That's why China wants one. That's why Japan built one. That's why Germany has one, because you want an automotive supply chain because it's massive. It employs a lot of people. There's a ton of innovation. There's a ton of economic development with it, and it just doesn't stop. It just keeps going for 100 years since the automobile, was. And you can flip it over to military production for tanks and trucks and all that sort of thing to the extent they're not doing it. And that's what we did, of course, in World War II. And that's how we won the war, with productive capacity. Okay. So the next thing now was this 301, Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act gives the president the authority to take trade action against a country that's violating international rules. And they documented China's persistent, massive, state-directed commercial espionage and technology transfer campaign like the world has never seen. We all kind of knew about it, but they documented it in a several hundred-page report, how they are stealing our tech and commercializing it there and then selling it back to us to make money. They have forced localization measures. You can't take your tech, you can't manufacture, you can't sell in China unless you manufacture there. You can't manufacture there unless you joint venture with a Chinese company, which is government owned. You can't joint venture with a government owned company in many cases unless you bring in interesting technology, because they're protecting their home market, and pretty soon your interesting technology that you brought is gone. They've driven you out of the market after 3 or 5 years, and too bad, so sad. And they're the free traders. People are defending China on this. They use spycraft. One of our members, American Superconductor, they actually use spycraft to get the passcodes for the software innards for controlling wind farms. And now 35% of Chinese wind farms use that stolen software. I mean, in like real spying plus hacking. There's 40 different methods of commercial espionage documented. And Peter Navarro, who's the president's trade advisor in the White House, said, I don't know how you compromise with China on this, because if they agree to give up 20 of the methods, they still have 20 left, right? So what do you do? So these tariffs of 25% they announced on the first $50 billion of Chinese imports were more targeted toward preventing China from reaping the benefits of their stolen technology by sending it back to us, and to get them to change their behavior. China didn't change their behavior. They put up tariffs on fairly traded goods, so they didn't even say, oh, we did wrong, you're right. They admitted nothing. They admitted nothing. The report is stark. So he said, we're going to do another 10% on 200 billion of Chinese imports. So then they retaliated again. So then the president said, okay, we're up in that 10% to 25% on that 200 billion of additional imports, We actually filed comments. There's hearings going on now on that issue. And we will win this because China is over-reliant on the U.S. consumer market for growth. They don't have much of a domestic market, which made the whole thing of 1.2 billion Chinese consumers a lie. They are producers. They are not consumers. They are not even consumers of their own stuff. And China exports $505 billion to us. We export $130 billion to them. Very small part of our economy, very large part of theirs. We will win if we don't blink. I don't think they will. So that's what's going on now. So the national security in trade is a key point to pivot point from free trade. And it is. That's why I say it's strategic trade. This whole thing of the American system, it's all strategic trade. There is no free trade. There will never be any free trade. It cannot happen. It is a pink unicorn that people like to write about and talk about, but it did not exist. It will not exist. It cannot exist. And then the series of turning China from this nice cuddly panda that's just trying to develop into a first world country, into a predatory capitalist, state-directed predatory capitalist like the National Security Strategy report released in December did. The past administrations considered China labeled as an ally and a partner. Now, December, the government started labeling them as a strategic competitor, which is different than an enemy, like the Soviet Union, but they're a strategic competitor. Then the National Defense Strategy report came out in January and said China uses predatory economics as a geopolitical weapon to get what it wants. This is the U.S. government. This is a big change from their trading partner, right? A lot of things flow from this. Then the USTR did an annual report and said letting China into the WTO was a mistake. And a lot of things are flowing from this. Even the New York Times and the Economist magazine, champions of free trade, the pink unicorn thing, said, yeah, our 20-year bet on China didn't pay off. It didn't pay off. But you shouldn't do it this way, right? So what's at stake here is China is on track to become the biggest economy in the world in 10 years. And we will not be. For our lifetimes, we've been the biggest economy in the world. We thought that's just what God intended, right? But we're screwing it up. We were 50% of the world economy after World War II. Now we're, what, 22%, give or take? And we're on a decline because we are offshoring our productive base. We have 11% of our country economy is manufacturing. Germany, they say, oh, you got to be a service economy to be modern. Well, take a look at Germany. They got 23% of their economy is manufacturing. That's where good jobs are, good wages, productive capacity, et cetera. We want to be an economy that's built on production and high wages, and you can't do that with open borders. Okay? So China in 10 years will be the biggest economy in the world unless something's done. And then after a bit, and they have their Ying Pai, which is their China hawks, their nationalist hawks that have always run. They want to be the next superpower, okay? And they will be. And if we're okay with that, we do nothing. If we're not okay with it, we got to quit funding it and quit enabling it. So that's what's going on. This is why it's really big. This is a 200-year-old debate, and we are now at a time where it could be a switching, a passing of the baton between superpowers. And we see it on the horizon, or closer than the horizon. So that's what's going on. For us, even our labor folks who did not like Trump and don't like him on many issues, like his trade team, AFL-CIO, Teamsters and the like. We've been, and I know RCAF has been helping too, we want to, the trade team is taking fire from all sides from the media. Our job is to provide the president trade team with, that we got their backs, that provide them with the political space to grab this territory, hold it, and go to the next step, or go to the next step, because we are squandering what we what the greatest generation created, we're squandering it as we are maybe the negligent generation. So I want you also to consider keeping informed with CPA. If you could you grab a pen? Those of you who have a pen, I want you to write down a number. It's a number that's 202-798-0987. That's 202-798-0987. If you text the word START to that number, you'll get on our list for receiving information. Just text the word START to that number, you'll get on our list. We need you, and RCAF is part of the Army. We need to show that we've got the trade teams back. We need to go further. If we're going to get further things like country of origin labeling, which we have some draft executive orders presented to the White House to consider on that, actually, and some of the other things going on trade, they need to hold on to where they've gotten so far in the tariffs. The WTO could be at risk in the future, and I've got this from inside sources, that the WTO will probably take on the Trump administration one day. When that happens, look out, right? The WTO probably is not big enough for both the US and China, okay? So there's a real rock in the hard place going to be happening there. So thank you for all you do. I probably talked too long, but I'm happy to take whatever questions Bill allows.